good.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the My Family Thinks I'm Crazy podcast. And with me today is a returning champion, someone that I always enjoy having on the podcast. He is a phenomenal researcher and very intrepid one at that. I'm excited to have Chaz of the Dead back on the show. Chaz, welcome here. We've talked about many things before. We've talked about your book and your expedition down to South America to track down the friendship. We've even talked about the Betts sphere down in your home state, the Sunshine State. Last time we talked, I think I did ask you where you're planning on going next. I wonder, did you end up going to Africa? I know you've been there before because you have some articles about it, but did you end up going to Africa? Because you said you wanted to go and check out some of the reports about possibly there being sauropods of some kind, some maybe lost species of dinosaur
Oh yeah,
roaming.
flying snakes.
Yeah. What's the deal?
Yeah, I don't know. I have not been back to Africa, unfortunately, since the last show. Still working on it. This goddamn economy, man, is making it rough here. You know what I mean? Not as many paranormal patrons in the world as there once were, but we're working on it. We're getting there.
Well, I
Uh,
think we,
and
we might be able to change that with this episode, and I think you maybe ought to get out there. But hey, Africa, that's a tall order, so I don't blame you for holding back. But given what we've heard from you before and your reputation, I think we're still in for a treat. You've been researching some stuff lately that I've been following up on. But for folks who maybe haven't heard our former interviews or your other interviews, tell us a little bit about what you do and who you are.
Yeah, so I write mostly. I got a couple books out, and I write for Paranormality magazine these days, and I do all kinds of paranormal research from Bigfoot, UFOs, ghosts. Excuse me.
And you are down there in Florida still, correct?
Yep, based out of Florida, but I like to do my investigations kind of all over across the U.S. and then across the globe. My first book was in Chile, a case I did down there. Go back and find that episode. Link in the show notes, probably. um, and then, as you mentioned, my second one was a case here in Florida, kind of reviving this old case, which is seeming to become more and more relevant as the days go on with some of these UFO stories in the news. Um, but yeah, anything that has high strangeness, a really good story, something bizarre, I like to go there and investigate. And when I say investigate, a lot of people mean they bust out their, EVP recorders and their spirit boxes or whatever. But I'm more of a fan of a good tab of acid or a handful of mushrooms, and then we try to do a little mixture of some shamanism, some occultism, and paranormal, and try to get the weirdest mixture possible because that's where these stories tend to live. And so, yeah, I try to meet them in the middle, I suppose.
I love that. That's essentially my same approach, although I can't say I've had many paranormal encounters on acid. I've had some mystical experiences on acid, but I
Mm-hmm.
love that approach, and it's definitely, I think it makes for a gonzo paranormal experience, which is what a lot of people are looking for. I mean, people often listen to a show like this and go out and do their own, hunting of whatever sort they seem suitable to where they live. Where I just moved to, there's reports of something called the Winchester Wild Man back in the 1700s. There's a town called Winchester
Mm.
up here, and it's kind of nestled in the mountains, sort of near the well, I think it is the Appalachian, northern Appalachian. So I'm sure you've looked into Sasquatch going all down the Americas. There's probably even reports of Yeti down in South America too. You wrote about that in your first book, but it is interesting how it seems like there's these different species of Bigfoot depending on, what region they're in. It makes you think of,
Absolutely.
zoology and how, you find like wolves look different depending on where they are. People are probably familiar, with bears. There's different types of bears all over the planet and they look different depending on where they are on the planet. But with Sasquatch, what's interesting is there are these like sort of environmental regional variations of Sasquatch, right? I mean, even Sasquatch is kind of a regional term, but
For sure.
despite that, they do seem to have this otherworldly characteristic that something like a bear and a wolf or might maybe don't have as much, right? I mean, I'm sure you've come across this in your research into Sasquatch, like
Oh yeah,
they
a shit ton. Here in Florida, even like regionally, it gets pretty different. Of course, a lot of people have heard the term skunk ape for the regional Florida Sasquatch, but there are quite a variety of that. In fact, the first skunk ape was actually not named for its putrid odor, which that's kind of my like test to see if a Florida primate or a squatcher knows what he's talking about is if he says they're called skunk apes because they smell bad. Common misconception. The term skunk ape actually came from a newspaper, I believe, near Panama City, in the panhandle of Florida. And it was a photo that came along with a Sasquatch sighting. And it was a Sasquatch, but it had a white stripe down its back, kind of like Pepe Le Pew in a Looney Tunes cartoon kind of deal. And so it looked like a skunk. And so that was the paper at the time had called it the skunk ape. And so anytime I hear like a Florida guy being like, it's because they smell bad, I'm like, you aren't as good at this as you claim to be.
Well, I love
Um,
that dispelling of that myth there. I appreciate you sharing that with us because, yeah, I mean, from all accounts, it seems like all Sasquatch have that odor for the most part.
oh, for
People
sure.
notice that there's a certain odor with Sasquatch. So, yeah, maybe that would be
Oh,
another.
and the aliens and the ghosts, man. They all smell terrible by all accounts.
Well, and that's the thing that really adds another dimension to it. I mean, just reading about it, your imagination might take you to certain, odors just through your,
Hmm.
visualization capacity. But, when people report something, those are the kind of things you look for. I mean, do you often go and talk to people, witnesses firsthand, and get those firsthand accounts?
Oh yeah, that's a bulk of the research I try to conduct, especially going to conferences and certain locations and stuff. There's always someone with a good story to share.
Right.
And when you're having that experiencing, you're listening to the stories. A lot of researchers make the mistake of they try to cherry pick details that match because they think finding these matching details constitutes as evidence. When in reality, we should be looking at the outliers of these cases, I believe, more so than a lot of the similarities. The similarities are documented, right? If something has if a certain experience has enough similarities, it breaks beyond the barrier of a hallucination into the realm of paranormal, right? If everyone saw something different in the woods, it's just it's a hallucination. But since so many people keep seeing the big hairy guy, it's kind of moved from the ravings of a lunatic to this legendary status. Now, how physical is it is still up to debate. Um, but it seems that once anything breaks that kind of barrier from the individual past the group to a societal level, where you kind of create this egregore, as one term out there, but this uh, archetype, as Jung would have called it in the subconscious, and that archetype seems to be able to create a physical impact. And I heard a great analogy once. It's kind of like saying, is Batman real? Well, he's not real, but there's books and TV shows and backpacks and Batman costumes. And in fact, there are people who dress up as Batman-esque characters and try to like fight crime. They mostly help old ladies across the street, but an idea has created this physical impact. And it seems that these paranormal entities, whether they be aliens, Bigfoot, or ghosts, they seem to have a pattern of physical activity. And this is my favorite mind fuck to drop on a Bigfoot hunter, which again, I love we're starting with Bigfoot because I think the Bigfoot community is tops when it comes to the paranormal community. People shit on those dudes hard, but they're funny, number one, and that's the best thing. For those I listen, I love the ghost hunting. Chaz of the Dead, I started with the ghost hunting, but those fuckers are sticks in the mud, man. It's a tough crowd. You're cracking jokes and everyone's like, why aren't you taking this serious? You know what I mean? And I'm like, this is silly. The whole thing is silly. Let's acknowledge it. It's a part of the process.
I love the subculture of paranormality, because it is true. There's the ghost people who have this sort of like goth kind of very serious kind of over melodramatic maybe kind of approach, and then Bigfoot. I feel like the Bigfoot contactees, and I have this written down because I wanted to ask you about this. There's a very wide range of Bigfoot contactees, but the forest and the wilderness naturally draws a certain type of people. So I think that is why you maybe see Bigfoot people having a certain crunchiness and wholesomeness for sure. I agree with that.
Absolutely.
I had a guy on the show recently. I'm not sure if you've encountered his work before, but his name is Sunbow True Brother. And
oh, dude, I've met him before.
oh, so you met? Tell us about your meeting of Sunbow, because I only sat across from him the same way.
It was a conference. I shook his hand.
Okay.
But it was either last year or the year before at Florida, the Great Florida Skunk Ape Conference, the Big Florida Bigfoot event, something like that, dude. It is again, my favorite paranormal event to show to, because again, everyone's super nice. All of those celebrities are super approachable. Some of those ghost hunter dudes, man, from the fucking Travel Channel, without getting into naming names and all that shit. Whew, tough, man. They're a tough hang. Like, you know what I mean? Like, it's like, oh, okay, man, sure.
Yeah.
Like, relax. You're a TV star. Have some fun with it.
Well, they take the subject very seriously, it seems.
And it's also really really kind of silly at a certain point because they take it so seriously, but like the amount of research behind what they don't do the reading, you know what I mean? They've got this framework, and it's the definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over again.
Well, and I wonder,
how many episodes of Ghost Adventures are there? How many years has that been on? Have they gotten it have they got a ghost in a jar yet? No. So clearly the process is a little broken, guys. Let's take some steps forward.
I love this. Yeah. I mean, I'm not an enemy of the ghost hunting community, but I definitely am a skeptic, and I don't think you're an enemy either, but it's worth pointing out.
Sure, but
I wonder,
we gotta help them out.
Well, I wonder if the seriousness is their only, way of clinging to this, because I mean, if they had any sort of silliness about it, it might expose the fact that there really isn't anything there to it. Maybe that's all they got.
That's actually the wild thing, is because in my experience, it is the opposite, and that's confirmed through research and through my personal investigations. And there's some good teams I work with on occasion here in Florida, Outcast Paranormal, and they do a lot of Bigfoot and a lot of ghosts. They're not too much into the alien stuff, but they're like kind of a mixture of a squatching team and a ghost hunting team. and they do some awesome, they're on the wave, the new wave, some psychedelic experiments and some weird tech that no one's tried before. They're doing new shit, which is so refreshing. But in this realm of ghost hunting, it's rare. It certainly is rare. It's slowly changing. But it's this paradigm, and it is, like a lot of things in America, they're trying to sell it to the middle America, so you got to sprinkle a little Jesus in there. It helps boost the sales.
Right.
You kind of got to go through that.
Well, it does play
Roman
into that
Catholic
paradigm
lens.
well. Yeah, it plays very much into that paradigm. And it does feel like there are some foundational cases that, make the topic interesting. Like there are real poltergeist cases and ghost cases that you can read about, and it makes your mind wonder, and there's evidence for this stuff too. I mean, physical attacks and bruises and things like that. But you got to wonder, if part of this is parapsychological, and the whole fact that you are investigating it is like nullifying any of the activity, like taking the camera crew into the place is like this thing that is inherently the opposite, right? It does not attract these sort of encounters.
Oh, dude, I have a whole theory about how cameras negate a lot of paranormal activity. But back to the point of having a good laugh and having a good time when you do these things, that was how most seances, when they started taking off in the 1800s, post Fox sisters, those ones were pretty creepy. But most seances where bizarre stuff happened, the atmosphere had to be jovial first. And this is well documented. Like you had to have some drinks and relax and like everyone get to know each other. Showing up and being super, super serious. It's like trying to go to have an office meeting. Think of any business, any kind of arrangement ever, and going to a meeting, and it's the fucking guy hosting the meeting is Zach Bagans, and he's like, fuck you, demons, I'm gonna fight you. And like immediately you're like, whoa, bro. Like it's this, you're not, the psychic atmosphere is not really conducive to a shared experience. Well, and honestly, I think that's why you've gotten shittier paranormal evidence as it goes on. And of course, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of examples of mediums and shit faking it from back in the day. But Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove from Stanford University does a really good documentation of like academics, like hardcore, well-respected, a couple Pulitzer Prize winners from back then who went to seances with the determination to debunk it, and saw some shit that they couldn't explain. Like they saw fingerprints and hand marks that were completely unique. No one in the room had any of those. Like it was some weird shit. And so there were some really intriguing evidence ever since it got, Jesus-y. And again, believe whatever you want, peace, love, and happiness. But ever since it got a little fundamentalist, let's say, where it's a good versus evil kind of dynamic, it really has reduced, I think, the phenomenon. And then you add the whole camera thing, which, if these things operate in a scientific manner, which, I think anything does eventually if we do enough science about it, if it actually has some kind of unknown physics behind it, the phenomenon certainly seems to be a result of a collective unconscious. A group effort going into it really seems to help. There was this really interesting situation from these. I went to a conference in Savannah about a year ago that was a ghost hunting conference, and this team had this really interesting documentary. They made 2 of them, and they've been studying this one house for 10 years. And I was like, that's awesome. Like that's the kind of dedication to these cases that we really need. Like, let's see the evidence. And their peak piece of evidence was after like 10 years of investigations and doing this whole thing, they finally caught this ball rolling on its own to the edge of the stairs and then falling down the stairs. And it's clearly moving on a level plane by itself, you know, in a intentional direction from a dead stop. It's weird, definitely weird. But this was after years of them, you know, studying it, looking for ghosts, hearing knocks and creaks. And they eventually discovered that it was haunted by two ghosts, and they were the ghosts of these little girls. And even though there was no historical evidence to back up two dead girls being at this property, through all the EVPs and communications, they had figured out that this was a dead girl ghost. And they were finally able to establish this connection after years of practice and yada yada. And the whole time I'm like, so you did a Philip experiment. You know what I mean? And for those who don't know, the Philip experiment was done by a bunch of Canadians, and it's been recreated a couple times. It's also been debunked a couple times. So, you know, do with that what you will. It's a psychic thing. So if you're out to debunk it, you're going to debunk it. If you're out to prove it, you're probably going to prove it. That's how a lot of these psychic things work.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was getting at before with the comment about the Travel Channel shows and like the parapsychological aspect to it. It's like when you set an intention, you end up getting that intention in that way. And I wonder, you know, my next question was going to be bringing us back to the big hairy ape man, which seems to be more human-like the more I learn about it than ape-like. But there's this overlap, and I love that we started on talking kind of about the subculture, the community of this research, because it is interesting to note, like, they don't always mesh well with one another. And you're someone who clearly likes to float among all the tribes. And I'm kind of the same way. I like that about you. And I think that makes for your research to be very well-rounded. And we need more of that. But when it comes to Bigfoot, there are cases where it seems like a phantom. I mean, you hear reports of people trying to shoot at it and bullets go right through it, or, you know, it can cause like all of these strange like mists to form and it disappears. I mean, yeah, there's some interesting aspects to it.
That's my favorite thing to drop on the Bigfoot people, because there are, like any human based network, there's some tribalism that comes into play, and the ghost hunters don't talk to the UFO guys, and the UFO guys don't talk to anybody because they're like, this is science. And you know, the ghost hunter guys are kind of like, this is Jesus. The reason I like the Bigfoot guys is because it's all over the map. That one's got a solid, there's not really a leading party there. You know, it used to be the guys who thought it was a physical, like, actual creature, but it's pretty all over the map these days. You have like the people who think it's feral humans. You've got this, you know, whole idea of what we're going to get into, this phantom Bigfoot, multi-dimensional. Some people think he's flat out is an alien. All excellent theories, and it creates a more, I think, open environment. I think you can get to the Bigfoot people a little more than you can break through to some of the other groups. And I try to when I do these conferences and hang out with them and stuff. And my favorite analogy, because it comes up, Chaz of the Dead, I thought you were a ghost hunter. What are you doing with this Bigfoot? Like, what, you're into Bigfoot? You ever seen a Bigfoot? Yada yada yada. And it's I always bring up how Bigfoot, everything he does besides being big and hairy, is the same as a poltergeist. If you watch the steps of a Bigfoot hunt, a Sasquatch encounter, it mirrors the same as a seance or as a ghost hunt. They usually start with maybe some wood knocking, right? Which is the same thing in the houses. You hear the knocks. That's how communication starts. And once you start communicating back, it starts to communicate back to you. And again, starts with knocks, usually evolves into vocalizations in poltergeist cases. Same with the Bigfoot cases. Everyone's seen the videos of the dudes calling to each other. And there's been multiple cases where separate Sasquatch groups end up calling to each other back and forth in the same like area. It happens, but a lot of times it's something else hollering back. Then you get in poltergeist cases, what we would call an apportation, where things appear or disappear in like really weird ways. In the Bigfoot community, they call it gifting, right? If you leave out a jar of peanut butter, that dude will like open it up, eat it, lick it all out, and then close the jar, which of course a normal animal wouldn't do. And then he might throw rocks or pebbles or things like that, which again, common appearances in poltergeist cases. The footprints also, which Bigfoot is almost most famous for, footprints, especially in snow and wintertime poltergeist cases, pop up a shit ton too. Not quite as much as in the Bigfoot cases, but you can find plenty of literature of ghost footprints. And of course, the ghost footstep is one of the common audio occurrences when the poltergeist case occurs. And then finally, in some of the most bizarre cases, you have the structures where people where they were hearing the howling, the knocking, they'll go check it out in the morning, and there'll be like a weird pile of sticks that was clearly put there. It was obviously not some kind of accident. They were stacked up in a weird kind of way. The same way a family who's experiencing poltergeist phenomenon might wake up and it's the poltergeist scenario where all the stairs are stacked up in like a crazy way, or all the dishes are taken out of the drawers and placed on the table even though they were away. In certain cases, this one family, they turned off all the lights, went to bed, heard this loud bang. They turned the lights back on, and there's like a full dinner being cooked in the kitchen. Like the water's already boiling, which logically doesn't like it. The stove couldn't have even been hot by then. And so you have these super bizarre, fractional changes which pop up in poltergeist cases and Bigfoot cases as well. Not quite to those extremes because it's outside. You don't quite have the same locales, but you wander across these structures associated with Bigfoot in the woods.
Well, and that's something that really fascinated me. I heard through the missing 411 research, I believe. Mm-hmm. It was either them or Laura Krantz, who I think is the daughter of Kranz or something like that. He's one of the founding 4 Bigfoot researchers. And they talked about finding a Sasquatch nest that it was proportional to their size of being like a baby bird in a bird's nest. It was a giant nest woven, and they said that the sticks were woven so tight that it would have taken like days and days for them to recreate something like this. And it was essentially like a giant bird's nest. I don't remember if this was out in the Pacific Northwest or somewhere in the deep South, but they have so many fascinating stories that I've been getting into about.
Absolutely. And the thing about the structures always gets to me because, you'll talk to the people who think it is just a monkey out there who's doing some weird shit. And they're like, well, it would be, they're building that clearly as like shelter or something. So if it is like the giant nest, bird's nest, though, you'd find feathers, you'd find shit, you'd find piss,
right?
You know what I mean? You'd find hair. If it was an animal nest, you'd find hair. You'd find these things. You'd find this physical evidence of this creature.
Well,
easy to confirm.
I think they were pretty dead set that this was some sort of creation of Sasquatch. They described it as looking like a bird's nest.
No, I agree. It is Sasquatch.
Yeah.
But it's a non-physical phantom poltergeist Sasquatch.
I see what you mean. Okay. Well, and that's
what I'm thinking.
And that's
why it's not covered in hair and shit.
Well, and that's kind of what we should make clear for the audience, because like you're right, there are, really nuances to this, because there's within this giant umbrella, right? We have Sasquatch, aliens, UFOs, which and ghosts, which all might be more similar than people think. But then within those, there are smaller umbrellas where people are like, oh no, Sasquatch is all. It's like the same thing with the nuts and bolts UFO researchers.
Oh
There's
yeah.
the flesh and blood Sasquatch researchers, and I think you and I are more comfortable entertaining all sides, and I like that in a conversation because, yeah, definitely when you look at a lot of these reports, oftentimes they have flavors of all three rather than just one. And I was going to ask you earlier when you made the point about researchers like calling to one another as if they're, doing knocks, and then they hear a knock and it's
Mm.
just another Bigfoot research team. Oftentimes the most interesting Bigfoot reports come from people who aren't necessarily interested in this stuff, right? Do you think
Oh,
that
for
plays
sure.
a factor? Like, have you noticed with the people you speak to that the more interesting witnesses are folks who weren't initially interested in the subject at all?
Well, I find that most people who are supremely interested in these subjects have had one of those experiences. And this is something I wrote about in my first book with comparing the psychedelic experience to the paranormal experience. And one of the big key takeaways is the reaction. And it's the same thing. So, if you take psychedelics, a good vast majority of people have this sense of oneness with the universe, this euphoria, this universal kind of feeling of mysticism and spirituality connected to it. Again, debates on what that feeling is, yada yada, whatever. But a lot of people don't have that. The flip side of that coin is a lot of people take psychedelics and it is the most terrifying thing they've ever experienced and they hate it. And this kind of duality is kind of a conundrum, especially when it comes to those people who are like looking for just a chemical normal explanation for it. But that same conundrum certainly appears in paranormal experiences. Whether it's Bigfoot, you have the lovable Bigfoot motif. Anyone who reads Bigfoot literature, which again, some of the best stuff, most believable stuff, absolutely not. But it is some of the best fucking reading material out there. Get yourself just a book on stories about Bigfoot encounters. The weirder, more obscure, the
I
better,
heard
I
one
promise.
recently where a woman had realized she had these Bigfoot in her backyard and she started leaving gifts out for them and they would give gifts back. And then she eventually started baking them cakes and she realized that they liked bunt cakes the best. So she would
Mm.
create these bunt cakes and she said that she saw them from her window picking the bunt cake up and eating it like a donut. And she even gave this researcher who took her witness account, her firsthand account, she gave her the recipe, so folks can even bake a Sasquatch cake if they want to attract back Sasquatches, maybe in their backyard or
That
somewhere.
being said, it is illegal in several states to hunt bears with donuts. So check the legality before you're out there.
Oh wow,
Oh
I
yeah,
didn't know
dude.
that. So you
Oh
can't
yeah,
leave.
bears fucking love donuts. And so for a big chunky minute, I want to say in like the 70s or 80s, when the Dunkin' Donuts were spreading across the nation. I don't know if that's true, but there was a time where people will like bait for deer and shit, and a lot of places that's illegal as well. But it's kind of more whatever. But if you were trying to kill a bear, if you got a dozen fresh donuts and left it in a general area, like it was, it's crack to them, and so people were killing shit tons of bears using donuts, and
Wow.
it became a problem. And
Well,
so I think anywhere in like the Pacific Northwest, that kind of area, you're not allowed to use donuts to hunt bears.
that's really, I'm glad you said that. And I do live in an area now where our trash is locked for bears. So,
There you
and I
go.
have a
Watch out.
donut in
Finish
my
your
backpack.
donuts.
I have a donut in my backpack. So I better eat that before I go on a hike. But Yeah, that's
Look up bear and donut plus your area, dude. I'm sure you'll find some stories. I
wow.
always guarantee it.
Well, and oftentimes people who, and especially like a lot of the earlier reports from the, 1800s, early 1900s, people will describe Sasquatch as like bears that walk on two legs. And,
Hmm.
clearly now we have more of an understanding, and, it makes sense that people would
Oh
think
yeah.
that way
Well,
when,
and they do that. There's plenty of video evidence, and it used to be thought like they only did it for tricks and stuff, but now that we have, lots of reports, we do know that a bear will stand up on its hind legs and it'll walk on its hind legs like a person for a good while. Like, not miles or anything, but like it will walk a few hundred yards. And
right.
so, the length of a football field. And
Wow.
so if it's night and you're just catching again, realistically speaking, I do think that has to account for a large portion of Sasquatch sightings. That being said, it doesn't account for all that other spooky shit we were just
Well,
talking
and
about.
and to that point, there are reports of what look like Sasquatch walking on four legs. So you have to wonder, maybe they're aware that they're being seen and maybe think to themselves, "I'll appear to look like a bear if I walk this way." I mean, that's another part of this whole Sasquatch world. I just mentioned Sunbow, and one of the things I learned from him, I've heard this before too, is that Sasquatch can make themselves invisible at will. Take that for
Mm,
what it's worth, and they're native
like a
legends.
chameleon.
Yeah, they're like chameleons. Yeah, it's hilarious.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I love this idea that there's this like hairy, version of humanity out there running around, and it's something that's reported all over the world. I mean, you talk about, sightings from Australia, Asia, even the Pacific Islands have some stories. The Solomon Islands have these hairy giant
Mm.
stories. Um, Russia, India, of course, Africa, and even Europe, where people think, oh no, that's all just from the medieval times. There's nothing there now. There's still reports of wild men. Have you ever looked into any of the wild men reports that kind of border on the line between like human and Sasquatch, where it doesn't quite fit the bill for what we think of as like the
Oh yeah.
what is it? Arthropithecus. That's the what the
Yeah,
flesh
I
and
think
blood.
that's it. That sounded
Yeah.
close enough for me, man.
But there
Yeah.
are these reports where they're more human like. They're like just kind of like they have human face but very hairy. The rest of them's very hairy.
Well, and that is also something that I've come to note as a key mark of the paranormal experience. There's always a human explanation for it. And I don't think, and I don't know if that's just because of, we're pattern finding animals. And so we're naturally going to look to debunk things and find that human explanation. But it almost seems part of the equation where if there's a possibility that a human's doing it, you're gonna get way more weirder thing if you set up a like controlled experiment. And this gets into some of the psychic experiments and whatnot done in the 60s and the 70s that were bizarre duds. But in the Bigfoot case, when it comes to this human explanation, very similar to the alien case, it's you're a good portion of people believe it's entirely responsible. Human beings are entirely responsible for these sightings, and even to the earliest Bigfoot encounters in America, as Charles Darwin actually wrote when he was traveling through Patagonia, and they were trading with some of the local tribes down there, that the tribes have these legends of these wild men, and he said that they described them more like giant hairy demons, but it also seemed like through his impressions that it was just people who had been banished from the village. So he kind of got these two different, even back then as a scientific thinking mind, he was like, there's kind of like a cultural thing here, obviously at play, but there's, they're talking about demons, but there's very everything that is described to them is very
Could it
human. So
could it be? And let's entertain some speculation here. Uh, could it be that these tribes understood that this group of whatever it was. Sunbow told me that there are evil Bigfoot and good Bigfoot, right? So let's call them the evil Bigfoot that the Native Americans describe fighting
mhm.
and being afraid of. Maybe they had it, in their sociology of the tribe that, well, when we banish people, we send them off to that cannibal giant group because, it's better to give them our have-nots than let them take, our young and innocent. So let's just give them the people we don't want to deal with, and like a tribute almost. I mean, it's kind of dark
Oh
to
yeah.
entertain, but wow, that's interesting. I know you've probably read it all, but there's a really entertaining story about the Sasquatch. I think it's the Paiute tribe, talks about chasing a giant red-haired beast into a cave and throwing a bunch of brush in the mouth of the cave and basically lighting it on fire. And I think a researcher tried to go and track that cave down, and he found it. And when he tried to go and excavate it to see if there was in fact a giant skeleton in there, the tribe was like, no, you can't do that because the giant killed a bunch of our people and they're buried there too, so you can't disturb their grave. And
Mhm.
there are federal laws around that too, so it's protected in that way. But it is interesting that in a lot of these cases, the physical evidence just always seems to evade whichever researcher happens to be looking for it. And I think that adds to this phantom angle to this all. Like, if there were a population of flesh and blood, ape-like creatures or human-like creatures that were hairy out
Mhm.
in the woods, you would expect that their remains would turn up from time to time. And I mean, there are reports of that with Mount St. Helens, with the whole eruption that FEMA came in and trucked off all these Sasquatch corpses so nobody would see them. And but it's something that I think evades researchers more often than not. This whole concept of physical evidence for something that may not even be physical.
Absolutely. And it's this it's actually rapidly becoming a problem in contemporary science, especially when it comes to quantum mechanics, which of course has kind of become a bit of a sci-fi buzzword these days. And a stoned dude on a paranormal podcast is not the guy to go for accurate quantum mechanics information. Read a book, people. I don't know, watch a documentary. I don't know, fucking whatever. But the gist of it, and as most people know, the layman's term is that these particles through the slit experiment have been shown that the particles, the basest unit of material we can see, it's what light's made of, it's what the atoms are made of, is all the tiny particles. They do not exist in a physical way unless they are observed. When they're not being observed, they exist as a waveform. And the way they test this is two slits, two particle size holes in those big hadron colliders. That's what those things do. And so it goes in one or the other because it's one particle. But when no one's observing it, when they only have these quantum computers running in the background, the particle is registering that it is in both tunnels at the exact same time. The minute it's observed, it selects one of the tunnels. And it's really interesting because the way it works is it fires the two particles in opposite directions. And whatever tunnel it selects, the other particle selects the opposite. It's random. It's a 50-50 random shot which one it'll do, but the other one always does the opposite, which gives this whole notion to this whole sci-fi idea that there is like a what do they call it in Superman, where he's the bizarro world, where there's like a bizarro Chaz, there's a bizarro Mark out
I
there,
see what you're saying. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
alternate Earth on the
Yeah,
exact opposite side of the galaxy, which is a fun idea.
yeah.
Um,
Polarity.
yeah. So again, maybe, who knows? but we do know these particles are fucking tricky, and that observation has a key effect on them. And because of that, we've kind of hit a wall. It's the same issue that happened with ESP research I mentioned earlier in the 60s and 70s. And again, Dr. Jeffrey Mishlove does a good breakdown of this in his Encyclopedia of Consciousness. But they were basically doing these experiments with random number generators where a person was trying to psychically influence it, making it do even numbers more often than odd numbers. And they found that if they had someone sitting there going even psychically, it would make a significantly above chance effect on the random number generator. For storytelling purposes, I always put this at 11%. But that's more of the upper limits. It's usually lower. But on a good day, you would get 11% higher than chance. Not like you're not gonna change the stock markets with that, but it's if you're going to war, you take an 11% power boost. You might sacrifice a virgin to get an 11% power boost. That might work out. Might be worth it. But the problem was when those experiments were attempting to be replicated, skeptical researchers came in and they had the same experiment run, and all of a sudden they were getting odd numbers, but they were still getting odd numbers higher than chance, even though the subjects were trying to get even numbers. And so on a bad, it would be 11% odds, even though they were trying to get even numbers. And so what they ended up discovering is it didn't even matter how physically far away the researchers were from the participants. If the participants had a bias that they didn't believe in ESP, it would affect the experiment negatively. If they had a bias that they did believe or they wanted to believe, it would affect it positively. And so the conclusion was, well, shit, you can't research this. Like there's no way to set a control. You can't have a control, so you can't have a genuine experiment. And so there's no way to know how powerful that influence is actually. And since it's not 100% or anything, we're just talking about 11% at the most. Science has kind of been like, well, we'll just ignore that. And it's kind of becoming this issue with quantum mechanics where they can't ignore it. They've spent billions of dollars building those hadron colliders, and the conclusion is, well, we can't have a control, so
Wow.
hopefully those nerds will figure out a way past it, and that's where quantum computing comes in, and that's where I get totally fucking lost and don't really understand any of that shit.
Well, and I don't think there is a way to find a solution to that. I think really it's a matter of a paradigm shift, because our overarching paradigm doesn't match with exactly what you just explained, and I think that's why all of these events and occurrences that we're describing, whether it's Sasquatch, ghosts, or UFOs, whatever category it fits in, that's why all of these fly in the face of science and our understanding of the physical universe. And maybe that's a paradigm shift that will accommodate all of those things more neatly, at least. I mean, it's definitely something that I think you've entertained through your research. But let's fold in another dimension to this, because I think you brought it up earlier where people noted that seances were more successful after they had some, drink, maybe smoked a little bit of who knows what. I mean, it was the 1800s, so they probably had opium and hash and tobacco and who knows what else. And so, but this is something that kind of fits, like even with indigenous cultures, they talk about, offering like drinks like alcohol or smoke, tobacco to the spirits, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even with like the Fae folk encounters, you'll have people being offered drinks and different foods by these spirits. So it's even kind of like an exchange in that sense, where But then to bring into the Sasquatch, you know, people give offerings to the Sasquatch. So, but how do you, you know, fit that into your research? Obviously, being stoned or getting a buzz off of whatever psychedelic you have at hand is a part of your process. How do you think that plays into this sort of quantum concept that we just described, and helps you sort of mitigate past this kind of physical paradigm that we've all been indoctrinated into?
Yeah, it certainly has a brain rewiring effect where you can have um, more of an understanding of these kind of concepts, because we do kind of fall into these reality tunnel perceptions, even though at the end of the day we all believe in some kind of nonsense. That's my new favorite terminology, and I don't mean to say nonsense as a dismissive term, but that's kind of a misnomer. Dr. Raymond Moody has a great book called Making Sense of Nonsense, and if the name sounds familiar, it's because he's the guy who coined the term near death experience, and a bulk of his research is into that phenomenon. But he's also, you know, a legitimate doctor, and so of course throughout his entire career, he's gotten a bunch of professional backlash for, you know, broaching these subjects and looking into it. And so this book was kind of his response to it. It doesn't touch anything paranormal. It's purely about logic and how we have this kind of failure in our modern language. And because the question he keeps getting is, why do you look into these things? It's nonsense. Why are you researching nonsense? And he's like, well, because someone's got to make sense of it. Nonsense as this you know, synonym for false is a total misnomer. A piece of information that's nonsense is neither true or false. It's actually kind of this crucial third piece of logic that has kind of missing in our everyday thought pattern, that kind of leads to a lot of the divisiveness in society, because it does lead to good or bad, true or false, right or wrong, when in reality there's a little room for some gray. And so, you know, the presence of nonsense, we hear it in music, poetry, Dr. Seuss books, right? It's pleasing to us to read Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy because it activates our brain in a way, and we try to find patterns within the words, and we find meaning within these phrases and words, but it doesn't actually mean anything yet, and that's his biggest point. And so his takeaway is, you know, science uses nonsense plenty. Of course, think of a religion. You can think of whichever religion you are not, listener, think of something silly they believe in. Perhaps Scientology. How silly of them to think that nonsensical thing. Two animals in every boat, or whatever. Yeah. Anyways, but science uses nonsense as well. Nothingness exploded into everything. That was the start of the universe, the Big Bang. That sentence, it's a contradiction. It doesn't mean anything. It's nonsensical. It doesn't have a true or false meaning. It's a clear contradiction. It's something Dr. Seuss would write to entertain a child. But that doesn't mean that it's false. It means it's a placeholder. It's a placeholder piece of information. And so when people come away from these paranormal experiences, whether it's the near-death experience, an alien abduction, you know, having sensuous love with a Sasquatch in the woods, whatever that paranormal experience is, it might sound nonsensical, but that doesn't mean it's true or false. It means the information doesn't make sense at this current state. And Robert Anton Wilson had a really good quote in regards to this. He went to one of these like skeptical science debunking fair conferences, which I gotta find me one of those. I don't think they do them anymore, but it sounds fun. But it was, you know, a panel of scientists saying how ridiculous all this paranormal stuff was, just taking dunks on, you know, Von Daniken and that kind of stuff. And he thought it was all a little silly, you know, a witch trial with no defendant or something like that. But the quote that stuck with me was that a quantum physicist came up to talk about, you know, how fake some paranormal shit was, and Robert Anton Wilson was well versed with like his writing and the theoretical nature of all of his work, and his takeaway was like he got the feeling that it was much like saying Salvador Dali is a much better painter than Picasso because it's more realistic. And I was like, that's a fucking great ass quote, because that about sums it up. Where we're discussing these two fields that are essentially nonsensical. None of them make sense. And we're nitpicking which one makes least sense. And that's true whether it's a religious person attacking a scientific structure attacking a religious structure. It's true when I sit here and attack flat earth and support hollow earth gang forever. It's true in, you know, all of these cases, where we're really arguing whose brand of nonsense is superior. And yeah, I'm gonna give it to science. It definitely does make way more bombs and guns and computers and shit. So it's, if we want to talk about like material ways to measure which one's better, you got that going for you. But obviously, if you're listening to this show, you're not entirely convinced that material means everything. And so obviously there are other values to religious nonsense. And so again, you got to learn to appreciate that nonsense, and not because you don't understand something doesn't mean it's false or fake or it should be rejected.
Yeah. Yeah, great points. And I definitely agree with that in many ways. Now, something that you just said got my wheels spinning, because it seems like with science, there's a point where culture has a sort of extent as to which it can develop science. I think people are maybe aware of the conspiracies against geniuses and inventors, and I think you and I can agree that science probably has potentials that are not being explored because of certain cultural parameters and things that are on the agenda, war and all that, as you pointed out, guns and bombs, right? And there's a need for that to a certain extent, right? But when it comes to some of these UFO reports, it does seem like there's an overlap between people who have engineering skill or an ability to create things and these paranormal encounters. There's more than one, more often than not, I'll venture to say, people who invent things and create incredible things that change the world often have these strange experiences in their life. Is this something that you've come across in your research? And I mean, what does that make you think of? Like, do you think there's a higher, force that these egregores, as we kind of started off talking about, you think these egregores have ideas that are kind of like coming forward from the future into the present somehow?
Yeah, so I'm glad you phrased it that way, because I'm currently working on a project where its focuses on individuals like that who have kind of uh, pursued these alternate theories of technology, and then either they themselves have dropped off the radar, especially if it's in the modern era, or in the previous centuries they had all their work fucking stolen. And of course everyone knows Nikola Tesla. how that all went down. Donald Trump's uncle got his hands on all that shit. Which time traveling Trumps is one of my it's prime stuff. It's good, juicy, great story. But that's one example of dozens of scientists who had these alternate technologies. And the reason we remember Tesla is because some of that has come out now and turned out to be functioning technology, wireless electricity and all that kind of shit, which again existed in the 1800s. We still have people today saying, well, that obviously came from 1940s when that Roswell crash occurred and the aliens gave us that. This fucking awesome Serbian dude was in his garage making remote control boats in the fucking 1860s or whatever. So again, I do think there is a lot to be said for that human influence, and this idea that there are other forms of physics out there yet to be discovered, alongside gravity and electricity and magnetism, these invisible, unseen forces that are yet still physical. And I think the particle realm, the quantum realm, is starting to bump up against that. I think things like light and consciousness, they exist in these super minute particles and a combination of these things. And so an understanding of that might lead to an actual understanding of a shared unconsciousness. That being said, I also think there's a good amount of evidence you could use it to fly around on some crazy fucking crafts and shit. And that kind of gets into the B theory, which I'm sure we've discussed on the show before. Go find that episode as well, whichever one that is. But this idea, it was Viktor Gorbachev, was a Russian scientist who, short and sweet version, is built a UFO based off of using the insect shells, the chitin hardcover of flying insects, beetles, bees, those fucking cockroaches, that giant ass ones that can fly we get here in Florida. All those things have these, insect shells, which apparently have this special formation which gives them extra lift, not through the traditional atmosphere, but through this alternate magnetism. Gorbachev called it the cavity structure effect. And like some of the later scientists, he discovered that it could be used for medical reasons. You could use it to stimulate, like the same way athletes put on an electrical little patch to stimulate a muscle. You could use this cavity structure effect to stimulate a muscle as therapy. He also built a fucking UFO.
Well, it's interesting the point about the Beatles, because I was looking into this. I forget how it came up, but I started looking into peacock feathers and other examples of iridescence in nature, and it's essentially the same thing, where these very small microstructures on the feather or on the exoskeleton of the insect create this effect where the light hits it in a certain way where it creates this color that's not really there. Like when you look at the actual parts, it's usually black or brown. It's not actually, like a peacock feather is not green or purple or blue. It's all brown, but because of the structuring of the little microfilaments, it creates this color effect. And people who experience UFO encounters, they often report the ships having this similar sort of color where it looks like there's like color, like iridescent. The term like oil on water is often described, which is interesting. Frog skin is another term that's often described when people look at these crafts. So yeah, I wonder if that plays into it the same way.
Glad you said that, because there's a lot of research in particular into scarab beetles and the variety of colors in that exact regard these bizarre reflective colors off of their chitin shells, which are the same shells Gorbachev says have these lifts. And of course, everyone knows scarabäeals have this deification in ancient Egypt. And if the technology works as described by Gorbachev, you literally could kill a bunch of scarab beetles, pull their wing shells off, stitch them together into like a chainmail sheet, and then slide it under a block, like a giant one of those giant pyramid blocks, and one dude on each corner could just grab the corner of the sheet and lift, and that would have enough of this extra super fluid lift to give it to make the block light. Supposedly Gorbachev had built several blocks out of these chitins, and he would tap them and they'd fly up to the ceiling and kind of float back down like a balloon. And so this technology, though, he essentially figured out that it was operating through a when he would travel on it, there was no like wind in his face or anything. He could go impossible speeds, but he figured out that it created kind of this independent bubble. And the second thing he figured out is that it was most likely super unhealthy to like be on one. Like, and the story that he kind of uses to tell this example was that he was an entomologist, which is how he discovered this, you know, a bug guy. And he would go and take this little flying craft he built to these research facilities. It was literally like a pallet with handlebars. He'd fly out. And on one instance, he put a larva in some test tubes, put them in his pocket, flew back to his lab, short little flight. But the larva was fully grown in his pocket when he got there. And that was something that normally took like a month and a half. And it had occurred over this, 1 hour flight. And that was enough to be like, oh shit, like what is this doing to my like heart if I'm zopping around on this thing. And he's just one of these examples. The reason I got deep into Gorbachev is because I had two separate sources, totally shady, but with connections to military intelligence, claim that UFOs were based around bees in some way or another.
Right.
And it is interesting. I did do a quick, like, if you look UFO sightings and bee populations, the line graphs are like an X. The bee populations drop as the UFO sightings go up.
Wow.
And in Gorbachev's model, we could just be killing those fuckers and breaking their wind flags off to build UFO outer craft material. Maybe it's a little out there, but the genesis of it was that this craft flew, and these insects, he discovered this third modality, this ether, as it were, through studying insects and through nature, and was able to build this flying craft and these medical devices off of it, even though he was an entomologist. And through my research, the amount of times that kind of story has repeated is fucking shocking, dude. It's bizarre. There was a dude, Strasbourg, another Victor Strasbourg in Germany. He invented the world's most efficient log flumes. They still use his technology in modern log flumes. Before, you used to have to use a shit ton of water to move, logs down the mountain. And he came up with this way of recycling old water and recharging it through circular patterns in these little vortexes. And you could use like 1/10 the water before. So it really upped lumber production in Germany. This was right at pre-World War II, though. So, not the greatest use of that lumber.
Right. I actually have one of his books, and yeah, I don't know. I didn't learn much about him, but I think he lived in America at a certain point in time. So he probably got out of there before things got dicey.
So that's yeah. So he has there's a institute I believe in Austria that's still like um it's some kind of medical, again based in medicine or whatever, institute that uses this technology, and they've done a really good job of uh let's say sanitizing Strasbourg's past, because he most certainly worked on the Nazi Bell Project, which was using slaves. Again, when the people, his ancestors and the people continuing his research are pressed on this, it's always, he was forced at gunpoint. He didn't want to do it. Yada 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 yada. Either way, he was involved in the infamous Nazi Bell Project. This was uncovered in Nick Cook's research in the Hunt for Zero Point. And again, he said, "Oh, I was just forced." But his whole vortexy thing was really interesting. He later built a flying disc off these same methods post Nazi time, supposedly. And towards the end of his life, he did go to an institute in Texas, where he was reportedly swindled out of all of his research. Like, he signed like a bad contract. They got all of his stuff. He left super pissed off and died a few days later in Germany. Like, he was like super upset about the whole thing, and like, according to his family, literally killed him. But one of these flying disc prototypes still exists in Texas, and they're like, yeah, I don't know, it's missing a piece, so it doesn't work, but here it is. What a weird story. It's like this, and I'm like, okay, yeah, sure, what a weird story.
Wait, where is it? Can people see it somewhere, or is it like in some sort of private facility?
It's owned by like an engineering firm or whatever. There was a documentary crew who filmed a Strasbourg documentary in the early 2000s, and they saw it. His son came there and saw it too, or whatever.
Well, now,
but he also designed a lot of, like, he designed this bioplow that churns the soil in this vortex pattern that's really good for farming, apparently. And he, again, the institute that continues his technology, most of the stuff has this medical purpose, and it works in the same way as Gerbinikoff's CSE effect and his medical devices. Then you have Wilhelm Reich, orgone energy, and anyone who's been in a New Age shop has seen an orgone accumulator at some point. Those little resin pyramids. Those are actually a beautiful piece of misinformation that has been spread by the New Age community, either intentionally or, accidentally, as they are wont to do. They like to latch onto something and go crazy with it. But the real orgone accumulators were pyramids. They did get that part right, but they were more like wooden and copper structures that you would like sit inside. And it was, again, a medical device. Wilhelm Reich was a psychologist. By the way, Strasbourg was a forester and naturalist when he discovered these water vortice principles, and then discovered his version of the ether with these other devices. Wilhelm Reich was a psychologist. He is actually in the same class as Carl Jung, studying under Sigmund Freud. And again, same region of the world as Strasbourg. Gerbinikoff was actually in Siberia, so he was Russia, but on the Asia side. And later, he was 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But Reich, he's 50s, 60s. He's right in that young time. And he did a lot of sexual theory, and he, hence orgasm, whatever. And he believed a bunch of positive benefits, believed, scientifically proven now, that there are a bunch of positive benefits to busting a nut. find the person you love and make love often. It's true. It works. It's healthy for you. But he also discovered, again, his own version of the ether he called orgone energy. And this became the basis of his technology. And he built these orgone accumulators for medical reasons. But one of the more interesting devices he built was a thing he called a cloud buster, which actually did the opposite. It formed rainstorms. And he was paid by local farmers throughout upstate New York repeatedly, like on a month-to-month basis, to come out and water crops with his cloud buster. And it was this big PVC pipe kind of accumulation of things, which strikingly looks very similar to some of Gripinikov's CSE machines. And this thing would create rain clouds. And on one instance, there's this story of him pointing one of these. He would water these crops, and during these events, he would notice like UFOs started like checking him out and shit. And so like one day he was like out, he was setting it up to water the crops and firing. He sees one of these UFOs show up, and he like gets this idea, whips it around real quick and fires it at the UFO, and like does the process that would accumulate a cloud right at the center where this UFO was. And according to the story, the UFO buckles and like falls to the ground and like starts crashing, and then kind of swoops back up at the last moment and then zips off in this kind of like panicked fashion or whatever. Like they were like, oh fuck, the whole thing's collapsing, oh shit. And so again, if the craft that Gorbanikov described flies through the same ether, the same orgone energy that supposedly Reich's machines were operating with, it kind of checks out. They bopped the bubble. the ship all of a sudden was in normal atmosphere instead of this other atmosphere,
like a anti-air cannon for UFOs. That's amazing.
Yeah, dude.
And I have a weird connection to Reich. My cousin, when he got married, probably like 6 years ago, he got married up in Rangeley, Maine, which is where they have all
the Reich Institute.
Yeah, he didn't get married at the institute, but I did happen to. I didn't know about it at the time, but I think I even was near it somehow.
Dude, and then, it's on my bucket list. I really want to get.
It's a beautiful area. I mean, I understand why Reich would have gone up there, but yeah, that was kind of a personal synchronicity for me. But I knew about Reich. There's recently Ryan Peverly of the Libre Ohio podcast. He's doing a documentary on Wilhelm Reich, and I don't know if it's out yet, but I think it's like a full. It's going to be like a multi-part project. I'd love
to talk to him maybe for the magazine about that, because I'm writing a whole chapter on Reich right now, actually, as we speak, for this project.
Yeah, and again, like these other inventor geniuses, he was subjugated and shut down for his research, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So his story ends with him in prison. He was actually arrested by the ATF, if I'm remembering correctly, and they confiscated all of his illegal medical equipment because he was healing people, without these illegal methods, without these proven methods. And they confiscated all of it. He died in custody, and none of his inventions or papers or anything have been released. So everything that exists today at the Institute up there, it's just whatever was like nailed to the ground and too big for them to fucking carry out, dude. And so that's why these fake resin pyramids exist today, is because no one actually knows what the actual recipe for a fucking real orgone accumulator is.
Wow.
That being said, people do make it into a big conspiracy. Wilhelm Reich was a fucking dog, dude. Like, he was sleeping with everybody's wife. Like, he was a bit of a scoundrel. He's fucking character, dude. Like, right out of a Quentin Tarantino movie, for sure. It's going
Wow.
to be an interesting documentary. I'm looking forward to it.
Wow.
Yeah, no, he's certain again, but the same story, right? So he discovers an ether, he invents a device that has some relation to UFOs. Um, he gets subjugated at the end, he gets persecuted, and his shit disappears. And so that's just three of what more than a dozen more examples from just the modern era, of people who followed this same line and then had this experience where they're either totally shut down and their shit's stolen or disappears in a mysterious manner, or in some of these more intriguing cases, in some of the more modern times, they come out with this technology, it seems revolutionary, and then just everything goes quiet, they disappear. And it's really synonymous with, in my mind, the Manhattan Project, where everyone really makes there's this grand story about it, right? How it's this amazing secret project that they were pulled off or whatever, and it was this awesome feat of military intelligence. It was, sure, the average person did learn about how powerful a fucking atomic bomb was when they dropped it. But to say it was a secret is a bit of a misnomer, because everyone working on the project, they were the top atomic minds of the Western world. So if you were going to university at the time and taking atomic science, anything related to atomic science, you would have noticed your professor was fucking gone. You know what I mean? There's like Nobel laureates who were giving lecture series who are just gone all of a sudden, and all of their mails being forwarded to the New Mexico desert. People knew something was up, you know what I mean? And so there's a very similar pattern that's kind of occurred. Specifically, if you look at some of the research around any kind of free energy device, there's this really interesting company. I'm blanking on the name right now, it'll come to me. But they produced a few videos of this generator that didn't need to be plugged in anywhere. It was this ran off of air and vans, and it worked in a very similar way to the way these Strasbourg's technology was described. And it was generating, a big setup in an office. And then they had a second video of it on like a remote island doing like the same thing with a bunch of lights and like shit like that. And then the company just disappeared. It just went dark. All the people who were involved in making it, their LinkedIns have never been updated since like fucking 2004 or whenever the videos came out. And yeah, they just gone. And so I think that I think they took some big lessons from the Manhattan Project and figured out how to get ahead of this one. The cat was already out of the bag on what atomic energy and atomic shit could do. The superfluid shit was still kind of under wraps. Not entirely though. And the reason I keep calling it the superfluid shit is because there is a actual scientific concept around this idea. It's not just ether, the force, or whatever. It's kind of been commandeered. But the reason it's been commandeered is because it has been in human society forever, this notion. Probably because there's something to it, maybe. But the reason I keep calling it the superfluid is because we do know of a element that does exist in this format. And that is, I believe it's helium-3. It's one of those heliums. When you get it to like, it's 2.61754, something really exact, degrees above absolute zero, it does this weird thing that no other element's been witnessed to do. And so at that state, when it's that cold, the helium is no longer a gas, it's a liquid. But the liquid simply phases through the container it's being held in. It'll drop through the bottom, it'll irradiate this out the sides, and more importantly, it'll climb through the middle of the glass and irradiate out the top edge. It literally teleports through solid object and irradiates and defies gravity. And so it becomes the state where the molecules are vibrating at the exact same pace in this harmonious way where it phases through gas, air, solid, whatever. And so the superfluid theory is that if there was an element that was naturally occurring that existed in that state, in a superfluid state, not in a gas or a liquid or a solid, well, it would be impossible to see, wouldn't it? It's the same thing as the quantum particle. It's the same thing as the ESP test. It would be something that is essentially impossible to observe, because it would be literally inside of all of our cells. It would be inside of inside of every table, inside of every lamp, inside of every ocean, sea salt, everything. It's inside of all forms, which again, if these things are flying, operating more akin to a submarine in the superfluid than to a plane in air, that explains why UFOs and craft similar can have that trans-medium travel. They can go through the ocean, they can go through air, and they can seemingly go into the sides of mountains and walls and shit and just vanish. As long as there's a place for it to phase back in, materialize back into normal fluid, you could land it in any kind of cave, fly it right through a wall. And so I think that there's a good amount of evidence that there's something like that going on. Well, now, again, there's so many ifs, ands, and buts.
Yeah.
But there's certainly a bulk amount of evidence regarding these scientists and their lives that suggests something's going on. And then in the addition, through my own experiences and research, there's something going on. I'm pretty certain to hear that something's going on. I'm literally waiting for the Men in Black to knock on my door any day now and be like, "Hey, shut the fuck up! Don't write that." I'm hoping, but we'll have to see how the book comes out at the end here.
Right. Well, if you do have the visit, please send out a coded signal, a coded message somehow. But yeah,
dude, I'm taking pictures. They'll have to shoot me, man. I'm fucking, because I'm also a John Keel student, and if you're familiar with those kind of Barker-esque encounters, you know that there's two kinds of Men in Black. There's the dudes with the buzz cuts and the fucking aviators who are your obvious, military narcs who are like, "Hey, shut the fuck up. Don't talk about UFOs, you hear?" And then you have your Keelian ones, which are like, "How do you eat Jello? What is a breast?" And they have like wires hanging out of their pockets, and they can melt coins in their hands and all that kind of shit.
Yeah, man. It's so weird.
The minute I see anything that resembles a Man in Black, I'm like football tackling. I'm fucking going for the knees. I'm tearing his clothes off. It's gonna be on the local news. It's gonna be like, "Man assaults Mormon fucking preacher." Because I'm like, "Where's the wires? Are you human?" I gotta know.
Oh man, yeah. Hopefully you don't end up in one of the Florida Man tabloids. But yeah, I think this. I would love for you to send me a link or something describing that fourth state of matter, that test or experiment that you described, because that's really fascinating.
There's actually old-timey video of it happening. It's bizarre that there's not new-timey video of it happening. Kind of fits with this whole hypothesis I got going, if you ask me.
Well, let's get into that, because I did want to ask you about the breakaway civilization, or the B theory, not to be confused with Viktor Grabenikov's B theory, right? There's the distinction there. But let's talk about the breakaway civilization, because I mean,
Oh yeah.
I've had Walter Bosley on the show, and he has a really interesting case about breakaway civilizations that people might be familiar with. This group of, Del Shao
Aero
associates,
Club.
yeah, the Aero
Yeah.
Club, and they were making these interesting dirigibles. And when you look at this chart, I forget, I'll try to find it for the show notes. There's this chart that shows the progress of, it's like a timeline from flying airship to flying saucer, and it matches up perfectly with the timeline between the Model T and, let's say, like an advanced car today, right? It
Hmm.
tracks, it's the same amount of time. And I wonder, when it comes to this breakaway civilization, if that's why we see all these things popping up out of nowhere, because they advanced the technology ahead of everybody else and had this huge gap that they were able to create between them and the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that, and that's interesting. That's kind of been the part of this writing project that keeps getting deeper and deeper every time I look at it, is the historical evidence that something's going on here. Because again, there's the easy route, and some people have written some books similar in this easy route, where you cut it at World War II as kind of like the starting point with the Foo Fighters, and you track some of the evidence from there. And the reality is, if these technologies work as described, I mean, again, let's look at our examples. Gerbinikov, entomologist. um Fucking Reich, sexual psychologist, quote unquote. They still use a lot of his shit today. Hey, I don't know. And then you have Strasbourg, who was a naturalist and a forester. These are all, um, you know, path research fields that would have existed in the ancient world in some various form, whether it was, in the guise of religion or shamanism, or, whatever it was. There would have been dudes who were doing bug shit. There would have been dudes who were doing sex shit. Everyone knows people were doing sex shit forever, all kinds of weird ones. That one we know. And there were definitely dudes cutting trees down and moving logs and doing what naturalist everything. And so these principles would have been available to them as well. Um, and so that's when it gets kind of bizarre. I mentioned earlier, the scarab beetles in Egypt, but we also have this really interesting story in Aztec mythology of Quetzalcoatl. He is, they always say flying. This is another one of those little tests I have to see how much research someone does if you're talking ancient aliens at me. The Bigfoot one. What was the Bigfoot one? Oh, skunk ape. If you know the true story, this one's another one of those ones. Quetzalcoatl, everyone's like feathered serpent. Obviously, that means flying reptilians, aliens, or whatever. But anyone who's done an ounce of a little bit of research would have known that flying serpent in the Nahuatl, the native language, was like more akin to like saying wise man, or like, um, old soul, like spirited individual. You know what I mean? It's more of a like a term of respect, and a person could be described as a Quetzalcoatl, like a current man. So it's more like a vague description of like a hero. He's the Jesus kind of figure, and so he's more human, like Gandalf. Think more Gandalf than fucking flying dragon. And if anyone says feathered serpent, flying snakes, that, and to be fair, there are a lot of carvings of like feathered serpents in Aztec like pyramids and temples and shit. So I can see why it's easy to make the connection. But it's one of those language things. And it's not that hard to find out if you've done some reading. um,
Yeah.
so There's a story though that involves him creating humanity, the current iteration of humanity, and I believe we're the fourth, we might be the fifth according to Aztec mythology. There were three great plagues, like incidents that wiped out. There's a flood myth right before us, which of course lines up with some other crazy theories out there. But after that flood killed the third incarnation of humanity, Quetzalcoatl supposedly went down to the underworld, and wanted to retrieve the bones of humanity to bring us back one more time. Give us another go, why not? And he made this pitch to the god of the dead, and the god of the dead wasn't really having it. So he gave him like one of these, godly, impossible tasks. He gave them this. Some translations say it's a seashell. Some say it's a solid cone. Some say it's a trumpet, whatever, with like a stump in it or something. He gives them this instrument and says, play a song and dance around the pyramid, or, depending on the translation, dance around my underworld realm, which at the middle is a giant pyramid. But dance around the pyramid and play a song, and I'll give you the bones. And to do this impossible task, Quetzalcoatl fills the cone with bees and does this dance around the pyramid. And he's able to revive humanity with this cone filled with bees. And this cone motif pops up again and again. It's in a lot of the Egyptian hieroglyphs next to some fucking scarab beetles. But it's also in the famous Floridian folklore story of the Coral Castle, which is this monolithic structure that was built by one dude in modern times. And famously, it was moved by himself in the middle of the night from like one acreage to another one, several miles, across the country. Not country, county, excuse me. And it's the several ton blocks. And according to the story goes is that the truck driver like pulls up and he's like, how are we gonna like do this? It's just me and you. And he's like, don't worry, go get some breakfast. I'll load the truck. When you get back, it'll be ready to go. And the dude was like, okay. And he did, and he came back and it was loaded, and he was like, fuck me, okay. And dropped it off, same situation. And supposedly some local kids saw in the middle of the night that he was levitating these stones using a cone-shaped device that was making this humming and buzzing noise. And he was like kind of like using it like a magic wand to levitate these stones. So again, weird story, lines up in this weird way with some Aztec stories. Then you have some weird situations with Freemasons and bees. Bees pop up a surprising amount in Freemasonry in their imagery and their ceremonies and those kinds of things. And of course, the Freemasons started among Masons, the guys who moved big ass stones and built those crazy churches and shit. And so there begins to be this version of history where perhaps the previous society pre-flood had some kind of again, put your tinfoil hats on, everybody. This is get your salt to take with this, grain of salt with all of it. Who knows what anything is real or not, but a fun version of history to consider. If there was a society pre-flood, 10,000, 20,000, whatever years ago, 20,000, I think it is, they perhaps had a superfluid-based technology, alternate to our electrical-based technology we use today. That's why we don't recognize any of the shit left behind as technology, because it's all made out of wood and cones and stone and shit. That was wiped out in whatever kind of calamity and flood myth, yada yada. The remnants had some kind of memory of this technology, right? This is where the Graham Hancock situation comes in. They're able to build pyramids and things like this, but as it goes on, the understanding of the technology is slowly lost over time. The Freemasons would be an extension of that. It would exist in the Egyptian secret schools first, which again is thousands of years. It's always crazy to think about how actually long that period was. Cleopatra lived closer to us than she did the building of the pyramids. So those were already fucking ancient in her mind. She wouldn't have even known about this shit. So it was probably something in those Egyptian secret schools that migrated over time to, Europe, and was probably once again kept secret by groups like the Freemasons, who still used it for its intended purpose, lift big rock. But they would use it more subtly, obviously, because again, they don't have as much knowledge. It's being diluted as time goes on. Up until you hit this era of the Del Shao Aero Club. This seems to be where this U curve, this down curve of knowledge starts to come back up, and understanding of these craft, because these first airships were very much flying boats. You know what I mean? And the only explanation, well, not the only, of course, this kind of makes sense if this is a psychedelic cultural expectation based phenomenon, right? You're going to see a technology that's comprehensible just in your ability to understand. Right. So it's a ship. It must look like a boat. It's in the sky. Give it something that looks like that. That might work. Or those sails are made out of wing insect shells. And it's a fucking levitating boat. One or the other. Could be one or the other. But as you said, that's when this kind of technological kick-in starts to occur. And I think it's likely that these early airships were probably a combination of what became Zeppelin technology and what the half of it became Zeppelins and airplanes and shit. And then the other half of it became these secret craft that are still being operated in secrecy today. You put some big hot air balloons on parts of the ship, and then you get a couple extra insect CSE chitin superfluid thrusters or whatever the fuck on the bottom, and it gives it that extra lift needed to make it much more maneuverable, as opposed to your typical air-based dirigible, which pretty much goes up and down and then leans left or right. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Not the quickest form.
Well, and there's tons of sightings in the 19th century of phantom airships, but one that really stuck out to me when I was doing my investigation into local history and the history of the state of Connecticut, I found that at the beginning of the New Haven colony, they sent out a ship with all these goods up to Boston, and they were hoping that it would return with all this money and, all sorts of goods, right? And it never returned. It disappeared. And a few days after it left, people reported seeing a phantom ship in the sky. And it turns out there are dozens of reports like this going back into ancient times. It wasn't always ships, but it was sometimes chariots, sometimes whole cities that people would see in the sky. And there was even a guy who saw the what he called the New Jerusalem, this city floating in the sky, and he drew all these diagrams that I think most people would recognize now as the circle and the square, and these basically these dimensions of the holy city of Jerusalem. It sent me down this whole rabbit hole looking into this, but it's interesting to think that New Haven had this sighting because it's one of these cities that's geometrically laid out like the same way you would if you were trying to recreate this New Jerusalem concept, which was an idea that the early colonists were all obsessed with. They wanted to create this Christian utopia here in America. And the phantom ships in the colonial times, there's dozens of other strange reports from that era as well. And even going back to, as Jacques Vallée points out in his book Passport to Magonia, you have this legend of Magonia where men from flying ships come and they take their, fruits of their labor. They come and steal like cattle and all kinds of stuff. It kind of reminds me of the cattle mutilation stories today,
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
from a more medieval perspective.
Absolutely. And so again, there is always the two ways to view it. Is this something that is occurring in such a bizarre manner that our minds are doing, they're doing the quantum particle thing. They're picking which particles to observe. We put a and we interpret it in a way that is interpretable. We see it in a frame of reference that puts some kind of sense into the nonsense that we're witnessing occurring in front of us. And of course, there's also the idea of the trickster, that the entity, whatever it is, picks the mask or whatever. I don't know. I think that's a little giving it too much agency, because again, why would some people see flying snakes and other people see UFOs and other people see ghosts? It's
Well, and
because
even a flying city too. It's like it seems like just an old term for something like a construction in the sky, right? Like a flying
oh
chariot,
yeah,
a flying. It seems like it fits whatever their cultural context is. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're participating in the process like psychically, like the whole egregore concept suggests. I think
yeah.
there's merit to that idea in some cases, but no, you have a point with these flying ships that it maybe is more likely that there's actual pilots on the other end of these things and they're not just apparitions based on whatever's in the mind of the witness.
Hell yeah. Hold on, give me 1 second. I gotta grab a computer charger. I'll
That's
be
fine.
right back. Hold that thought. Cut this. Cut this. Cut this. I certainly think that makes the most explanation. And so again, that kind of rides a little catty corner to the skeptical explanation of it's all in people's heads. Um, I think it's the what you're seeing, your perception of it is in your head, but there's something physical going on there as well. Now, is that physical thing human based or not is still a a conundrum that pops up. And even with this fun theory of alternate craft, we're still having to leave out a lot of shit. And that being said, there is a good amount of evidence, and this is why I think there's a little bit more to this B theory, this alternate history of UFOs, um, because through Gorbachev in particular, and some through Reich, Strasberg didn't really mention any of this stuff, though he was kind of hippy dippy and weird. But Gorbachev explicitly stated flying the craft and operating it frequently would cause a bunch of paranormal activity, like poltergeist shit, to occur wherever he landed it and used it often, as well as a bunch of weird psychedelic effects as well. Missing time and that kind of stuff was a side effect of flying it too frequently. And so if we're exploring this superfluid theory, these things are operating as if it were a submarine through the superfluid. Well, it would create a wake as it traveled, as a boat would, right? A little wave in the superfluid. And remember that superfluid goes through our bodies and inside of our cells and inside of our organelles as if it were radiation or any other invisible particle, um, x-rays or whatever. And so there's a good amount of evidence that just standing next to one of these fuckers might cause a spontaneous psychedelic experience, which would explain why a lot of the bulk of UFO encounters are so bizarre and strange and um, unattainable. There's even a fun side thought experiment here in this realm when it comes to, all right, let's continue. Let's continue our timeline from the Dello Aeroshell Club up into modern times here. This idea that this technology was eventually captured or shared or whatever, or just again independently discovered by scientists like Strasbourg in Nazi Germany or however it occurred. And they start building these UFOs as well. Well, we know from the first encounters when UFOs first show up in the battlefield, it's the Foo Fighters. And immediately the US is like, oh shit, this is some kind of like weird Nazi weapon. That's the first instinct from people seeing these things. And I think that's important. But they notice that these things zoom at them and then they just phase through the side of the plane. They just phase through the side. Again, just how they've been described to operate by Gorbachev and some of these other, well, just in general through superfluid theory. And so we continue to see them more as probes and things like that. They stop zipping through. Foo Fighters kind of hang to the distance and follow planes around and shit. But and they eventually become considered like an omen of like bad luck and shit. And so if you are getting followed, they'll like turn back around and whatnot. So I think what might be happening there is the Nazis built some little probes based off of these principles, but they didn't nail it because they couldn't get them to shift out of superfluid travel. So they were shooting these cannonballs at these planes, trying to blow them up with these hyper fast little orbs using superfluid travel. No human inside of them because, again, all the psychedelic and bad health effects makes it really hard to fly one of these operationally. And another interesting point is that Gorbachev said that if you dropped a like test tube or something off the side of the craft when he was flying it, it wouldn't just fall down and hit the ground. It would fall to like the edge of the bubble and it would disappear. And if you'd like, on one instance, he dropped something over an apartment building and all of the windows had these perfectly burned circular holes in them. And he found the piece of test tube fused inside of a window on like one of the floors. And so it caused all of these weird effects. In military terms, it means you can't put a fucking machine gun on it, right? You can't fire through the superfluid, whatever. It has some kind of effect. You're scattering the particles of whatever you're firing, or dropping off the side. And so they tried to blow up planes with these little inert cannonballs flying through the superfluid, and it didn't work. But they're onto something. And so the bell, again, in this version of history, is not a heavy fluid centrifuge. That's the current theory by modern historians, this kind of crucial piece of their nuclear program. It indeed wasn't that. It was actually an attempt to build a larger operational either power device or craft using the same principle, or perhaps bomb using the same superfluid principle. Maybe if you blow up a stick of TNT inside the superfluid, the explosion scatters through the whole thing. Maybe you can level a nation instead of just a city. Who knows? But they put all their time into doing that because they did have a semi-functional example of potentially what a weapon like this can do, and possibly fast travel. You could blow anything up before you would ever know. And even though they couldn't hit these planes, if they could figure out how to deliver a bomb that way, then fuck, you win any war. You can send a goddamn fucking bomb into Churchill's office without him ever noticing. But they lose the war. The U.S. captures this, and or they get help from this Delushao Aero Club, one of these other breakaway societies. Again, the U.S. is already based in Freemasonry hardcore, so they probably already had at the highest levels some kind of understanding of this technology. They capture it, figure out how where the Nazis fucked up, and we begin our own operations. And so in this, again, fun alternate history, which let's make a comic book, man. This is some good shit. In this fun alternate history, I got to loop in the JFK assassination somewhere here. That's the only thing missing. But in this alternate history, we start this operation of building these crafts. One, we perfect the cannonball, the Foo Fighter. That's all these metal spheres we see nowadays. And those are the checkmate to the nuclear missile, right? If you start firing a nuclear missile, we can send one of those balls right at it, blow it up before it even gets fucking 10 feet off the ground. And before a radar even picks it up, if the technology works as described, and if they were able to figure out how to shift these cannonballs from from superfluid travel to physical travel, put a little switch on it, hit a button, drone bomb that fucker, and so, boom, easy. And if that is the case, we know if the Bet sphere was one of those spheres, if these spheres that have crashed all over the globe are just parts of this defense system, they've crashed in Mexico, they've crashed in Russia, they've crashed all over. There's a good chance everyone's got that one at this point. That would be our base level of, that's like the biplane of the UFO. You know what I mean? It would be the base level. And so, effectively, in this version of history where we are at now, the nuclear missile has been checkmated. Well, that's why no one's got the ball. No one's going to fire one, even if Putin wanted to nuke Ukraine. If you just try to fire one, it would blow up, whatever. Even nuclear submarines are checkmated, right? These things have trans-medium travel. So we could just shoot a fucking cannonball through your goddamn submarine before it fires its missile. Boom, your ocean is nuked.
Wow.
And you know what? We'd probably tell the news it was an accident and that you guys fucked up. Good luck explaining that.
Right. Wow.
The alternate version is, again, continuing this idea, is all right. So the other part is that's good and well. We've checkmated nukes. Again, maybe you can put a nuke inside one of those. And beam it over. Perhaps that is a alternate attempt. Who knows? But again, of course, you'd want to put people inside one of those at one point. And so this is my favorite side theory of the whole thing, is that perhaps the burned up documents of MK Ultra would have revealed that the whole point of randomly drugging people and putting them in these super bizarre and intense scenarios was to see how naturally adept they were at reacting to high stress scenarios while tripping fucking balls. Because if you can do that, then you can probably fly a UFO. You know what I mean? Like that's a recruitment process. It's the same way they do like the what's the Cicada 306 or whatever, the high class NSA recruitment, where it's this crazy puzzle, impossibly difficult fucking thing to do. And supposedly it's an NSA or Illuminati or whatever recruiting experiment that only the best hackers in the world can figure out. Kind of like that, but it's just putting LSD in a bunch of random people's fucking fruit punch and seeing who can keep their cool. And so that program was developed purely in mind of finding suitable candidates. And that's why, again, most of them were military, but also just pull in the random public. You might, you never know when you find someone who might just be good at those kind of scenarios. And so that again leads into some of these other theories. There's a great book. Fuck, what's that guy's name? Someone send in an email. Someone in the audience will know. There's a guy who wrote a book, and his explanation for cattle mutilations is that specifically in the like Colorado and the West, they were, and this is known, they were blowing up nuclear weapons underground, testing out these weird, yeah, dude, it's super fucking bizarre. Look this shit up. It's so, and this is like a whoopsie, yeah, sorry about that. And they were blowing up these nuclear tests underground, deep underground. And you know, it was poisoning drinking water and shit like that, and mostly for Native American land, so no one gave a shit. But this guy who was writing said all of these cattle mutilations were within areas where, you know, the bulk of the big waves of cattle mutilations were in areas where right above where testing was likely occurring. And so his theory is that the reason it's always anuses and eyeballs and whatever, yada, yada, is those are the places where radiation sickness first shows up, and as well as other bovine illnesses. And so his thing is it's like the military just clandestinely testing cattle to see if they're sick or not. It's a really interesting theory. And, you know, trying to cover their asses. And the reason they're doing it in secret is because if they are sick and like the ranchers find out, you know, millions of dollars of lawsuits, yada, yada, yada. So they just do it with that. And so his whole thing is that the UFO stuff is all nonsense and they probably just use black helicopters. But if this theory is true, perhaps it is a bunch of dudes tripping balls in a UFO testing out on the cattle. Because what else would you use? You have these UFOs sitting around. You might as well use them for domestic operations and little operations here and there. They're the most efficient. If they work as described, you literally could clock in for an 8-hour shift on a UFO, fly to anywhere in the world, fucking assassinate somebody or like probe an anus or steal a cow and then be back home for fucking dinner. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Or
wow.
breakfast. I bet they do it. I bet it's a night shift.
That's really weird, and it's interesting. You mentioned the factor of like the what was it? The larvae growing rapidly. You know, with a lot of the abductee and UFO encounter scenarios, it seems like whatever these gray aliens are, some encounters seem to suggest that they're a version of us from the future, and maybe their use of this technology for an extended amount of time has made them these diminutive gray entities that were once human beings. Like maybe they've been so irradiated and changed over time from using this technology that they are human. They just have like morphed, genetically changed to not resemble us really at all. But a little bit of a wilder theory, but I really appreciate awesome. That.
If the superfluid hypothesis is true, who knows what kind of travel is capable? All of what we're discussing here is what we know of superfluid and how it interacts with things on Earth. No one's frozen hydrogen 3 in space and seen how superfluid reacts in space. If superfluid is on Earth and it's in every particle, it's most likely throughout the void as well. And so perhaps those are fucking aliens we've traveled to and they've traveled to us. They're like, oh, you figured out the superfluid thing. Here we are, guys. What's up? Because it theoretically faster than light travel would be possible because you're not traveling, it's frictionless travel. You're not traveling through a vacuum. You're traveling through this essentially the slipperiest water in the universe. You're just sliding forward infinitely with infinite momentum.
Wow.
Um, so it could be aliens. It could be time. Perhaps there is a way to, with this superfluid, it affects time. You can do time travel-y shit. Maybe that's where Bigfoot's coming from. It's, again, if you operate these craft often, it creates a variety of paranormal phenomena. Perhaps that involves time altercations and allowing other people with weird crafts showing up, or fucking accidentally teleporting a Neanderthal monkey man from fucking 2 billion years ago who's just super freaked out for like an hour before he phases back to his reality.
Right.
I think about Skinwalker Ranch when I think about this theory a shit ton, because the whole story is of Robert Bigelow buying the ranch, and of course he's one of the biggest military aviation contractors in the world. And so perhaps there's another way to look at this. Perhaps he bought this ranch specifically to study those long-term effects of what operating a craft like this does to an area. He was like, all right, I'm buying one of the old UFOs from the government. Where have they been? They've been stealing cattle from this ranch for a few years. All right, I want to buy the ranch and see what, like, how long do these side effects last, like, and what kind of side effects occur from operating it multiple times in this area. And so he hired a bunch of scientists without telling them what was happening or anything going on, and just to observe it normally. And then when the effects kind of weared off or whatever, he's like, all right, sell it to the fucking Travel Channel.
Right.
Sell it to what's his face, Brandon Fugal or whatever. And so again, I think it's a great fucking story. And here's the problem: is it's too good of a story, which leads me to doubt it, even though, again, it's at this point it's the story I'm telling. But again, it does line up a lot of these little mysteries. That being said, what happens next? You're certainly not going to get any kind of traditional government disclosure. The next thing, if this is true, then the next thing to happen, and it's looking like it'll be soon, is going to be your Hiroshima event. It's going to be the event where everyone finds out about it. Just like the Manhattan Project, if you were in the academic circles, if you were in a fucking atomic science class in the UK or Europe, any of the Allied states, you knew the US was working on something big. Just like we, who are just talking about these scientific weirdos, these outcasts, these outliers, we know something's occurring, and I've made all these kinds of speculations. These are the same kind of speculations that they were like in the I assume, I haven't seen it yet, but I assume are in the front half of Oppenheimer, where they're like, if we set this off, it could blow up the whole atmosphere and kill everybody, or it could not work at all. I'm doing that right now. I have no idea what this technology actually looks like when it's up and functioning, other than it's most likely some kind of flying craft. It could have very simple, reasonable, limitations. It could be slower than light travel very easily. There could be lots of there's probably a happy medium, is what I guess I'm saying, just like the atomic bomb, which is a terrible thing to say. Well, that was a happy medium, but compared to blowing up the whole atmosphere and everybody dies, it's gonna be something like that. Though there's gonna be an event where one of these craft will be definitively shot down in a way where they can't be like, oh shit, let's cover that up. The same way with that helicopter that got bin Laden was a secret fucking helicopter, had a bunch of stealth technology that was not public, became fucking public because Pakistan was like, look at it, look what they did.
Right.
It's gonna be something like that, where, again, no matter how good the technology is and how bizarre it operates, if we're using it in this military setting, someone's gonna fuck up. It's a miracle we haven't fucked. Well, we probably have fucked up. There's tons of reports of UFO crashes all over the globe. Luckily, apparently, when you fuck up, the psychedelic effect is still pretty heavy, and so everyone just sees a bunch of weird aliens anytime you crash somewhere. Again, all UFO crashes, most encounters on are grays. Bulk majority of like crashes and landings when people see things shoots the fucking gamut. You have your praying mantises, you have your what's the one in West Virginia, the Flatwoods Monster, whatever the fuck that thing is, the fucking green and red cone man thing. Pascagoula, Mississippi, you have like the tin guys with the pointed ears, the cones on their heads as well. You have these super bizarre creatures that are bizarre. Again, it's like taking a bunch of mushrooms and seeing a bunch of weird fucking entities. They're all kind of different each time. They're still vaguely humanoid. But they're machine elves, man. They're all kinds of fucking different. And so it's very, very similar. So perhaps again, Roswell and these crashes, these famous crashes, are just these fuck ups. But again, one of these fuck ups is gonna go public at some point. It's gonna be that moment where the rest of us find out about it. It's gonna be oh well, there it is, and they're gonna be like, yeah, okay, and this is how it works. The same way they did with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They're like, yeah, we were doing it the whole time. Okay, this is how it works. And so that process was a process. We did not want to reveal those secrets, obviously, for obvious reasons. But it does seem like we're in a scenario now where if this is the case, China's got them too, or Russia's probably got. Gorbachev was Russian, so whatever happened to his shit, there is a question mark on his story. He died in 2001, and there was a researcher that was corresponding with his son, and that researcher died, and the whole story's gone quiet. All attempts to get in contact with him have led to nothing since that kind of era. Wow. But he was a real dude. People still write scientific papers quoting his like research. There's a university in a town in Siberia that has a bunch of his inventions in like a museum, like his medical inventions and shit. Again, he's like a Russian Wilhelm Reich. And so wherever his flying craft, I think it's probably safe to say it wound up in a museum. But one of his biggest takeaways when he was operating it, the two reasons he stopped using it. The first one we discussed was because obviously he was like, this is probably super unhealthy. But two was that he noted that people were seeing UFOs all over the place, not just when he was flying his little craft over the Siberian towns. And it was important to note, even though his craft was like a pallet with handlebars, when people looked up and when he was flying it, they'd see glowing discs or triangles or tubes. They would see these geometric light shapes. Again, he believed it was something to do with the refraction of this ether, light reflecting off the ether while you're traveling through it. But he did sound off all your UFO shapes. And he concluded that since UFOs were being seen all over the place, not just when he was flying them, that obviously other people had discovered this technology and this secret, and they weren't telling people. And so, being a fucking Russian, growing up in Soviet Russia, he was like, well, I ain't going to say shit because this will only end bad for me if I, go public with it. And so he only went public at the end of his life with his memoir. Supposedly folded up the craft and stowed it away somewhere until, and again, question mark on where that ended up. But if this, again, the technology can be built off of insects, It can be built off of fucking log flumes. It can somehow, you can get the technology by studying orgasms. The point is, it's acquirable. And so at this point, I think it's pretty safe to say that most nation states, at least not most nation states, the big ones, the big dogs who can afford to dump research into quote unquote pseudoscience, probably have at least those cannonballs. And we know that because we've seen them on fucking Elon Musk's rocket launches. We see them hovering around. And I think that's like, hey, we can blow up your rockets too, man. Like we're flexing back at you guys. We know you're flying UFOs and doing UFO ops and shit, but so are we.
Right.
We're in this. We're currently right balls deep in what the future will call the UFO Cold War. Maybe again, grain of salt. You can wipe the salt out of your mouth. Take your tinfoil hat off. I'm done. But that's the gist of this alternate picture that's kind of formed.
Round of applause, standing ovation. Chaz of the Dead. Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. And yeah, this has been a really fantastic conversation, man. I mean, we ran the whole gamut of paranormal phenomena, which I think is exactly what I expected from a guy like you with your full wide spectrum of knowledge, and you've researched so many things. There's still a couple questions I didn't get a chance to ask you, but I'll save those for next time. Of course, people should go and check out our first two interviews, episode 118 and episode 207. 207, we talked about the Bet sphere, which might be one of these cannonballs, as you put it. I like that description. And yeah, man, what for the folks at home, obviously they can go to chazofthedead.com to keep up with everything you're doing, but what can we expect in the near future? Do you have any plans for the next couple of months? Anything that you're working on that's ready to come out? Or
yeah, I'm hoping to have a full length, more in-depth version of what I just talked about on here, in book form, hopefully out by spring. It keeps getting pushed back by me because I keep finding more shit to write about. I've got a atrocious list on my whiteboard of stuff I got to get into. But again, all that side diatribes, we still only scratched the surface of all the shit evidence supporting this kind of story. That being said, find all of that shit, little updates. I'll be sprinkling them throughout Paranormality magazine. So get a copy, get a subscription, paranormalitymag.com. As you said, chazofthedead.com for all of my personal appearances, articles, books, links to Patreon, all that stuff. And then at Chaz of the Dead on all the social media stuffs. I haven't been posting too much lately because that shit's bad for you, but I'm a hop back on. I got some good photos, and we're gonna get out there and advertise. So
cool.
Follow me on all that shit. And thanks so much for having me on, man. This is always a blast.
I love it. I love having you on, man. You're welcome back on, especially when that new book comes out. I'll put it next to this one. Folks, go and pick that up. Paranormal Expeditions, Hunt for the Friendship. Chaz's first book, right? That's
the first one.
Great. Yeah, okay, cool. So, yeah, we'll look forward to the next one. And until next time, folks, immerse yourself in the moment wherever you are in the now.